She was only 8 years old, far too young to understand why life could be so cruel. But when her mother lay barely breathing in a cheap clinic on the outskirts of Chicago, and the doctor declared that without $500 before 8 o'clock the next morning they would stop treatment, the little girl didn't cry. She had learned long ago not to cry. Because tears didn't buy medicine, didn't pay hospital bills, and didn't make her mother open her eyes. Instead, she lifted her mother's heavy bucket of flowers, the same bucket her mother carried every afternoon to sell on the sidewalk for a handful of coins, to keep the two of them alive, and stepped out into the street. Alone, beneath the scorching heat of summer, with the narrow shoulders of a child who should have been sitting in a classroom. She didn't go to the poor neighborhood she knew so well, because she knew the people there had no money either. She went straight to Gold Coast, the wealthiest mansion district in the city, where the iron gates stood taller than a grown man, and the cars were worth more than the apartment where she and her mother lived. She was driven away, humiliated, shut out again and again and again. But she didn't stop. Not until she stood before the last gate on the street, a towering black iron gate guarding a mansion that looked more like a fortress, the home of one of the most powerful and dangerous men in Chicago, a crime lord whose name alone made the underworld shudder. And what the little girl found inside that mansion was not money. It was a photograph of her own mother, hanging in a place of honor on the wall of the crime lord's study, a secret buried for 9 years. A love story that should never have ended, and a lie that had condemned 3 people to 9 years of pain, separation, and tears. Sit back now, because the story of how the courage of an 8-year-old girl, clutching a bucket of flowers, stepped into the world of the Mafia and, by accident, brought 2 hearts torn apart by power, fear, and lies back together, will hold you captive until the very last moment. If this story touches your heart, please press the like button and share it so that more people can hear it. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories that will be even more moving than this one. In a small hospital room at the very end of the hallway in the cheapest community clinic on the outskirts of Chicago, a little girl sat in silence on a white plastic chair stained yellow with age. Her name was Hope. She was only 8 years old. Her feet could not reach the floor, so they swung gently in the air, but the rest of her body was completely still. She was holding her mother's hand. The woman's hand was burning with fever, pale as paper, lying helplessly on a thin bedsheet that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent. Her mother's name was Audrey, 27 years old, yet her face now looked far older than her age. Sweat soaked her forehead. Her lips were dry and cracked. Her eyes were closed. Her breathing was slow and labored, so labored that each breath sounded like a plea. The room smelled of disinfectant mixed with the damp, moldy odor rising from yellowed walls stained by old rainwater leaks. The ceiling fan above turned so slowly it was almost meaningless, creaking in a steady rhythm as if it were counting down the time. Hope didn't cry. She had learned how not to cry a very long time ago. The last time she cried was when she was 5, when her mother collapsed in the street while selling flowers in the rain. She cried for a full hour beside her mother lying on the soaking wet sidewalk, but not a single person stopped to help. From that day on, she understood that tears changed nothing. Tears didn't buy medicine. They didn't pay the rent. They didn't make her mother open her eyes. So she stopped crying. She looked at her mother's face, bent down very close, and whispered in a voice so soft that only the 2 of them could hear it. "Mother, wake up. I'm here." Audrey didn't move. Her eyes stayed shut. Her lips stayed silent. Her chest continued to rise and fall slowly, as though she were drifting farther and farther toward some distant place Hope could never reach. Just then, the hospital room door opened. A tall man stepped inside, wearing a white coat that was slightly wrinkled. It was Dr. Warren. He held a brown medical file in his hand, and his face carried the exhausted look of someone who had worked too many hours and witnessed too many sorrowful things. He stopped at the foot of the bed, looked at Hope, then at Audrey, then back at Hope again. His eyes told her before his mouth did that he was about to bring bad news. "Hello, sweetheart," he said gently. Hope stood up at once, her back straight, her hands falling to her sides like a child already used to having to appear polite before adults in order to be heard. "Hello, doctor." Dr. Warren opened the file, turned a few pages, then let out a sigh. "Your mother's condition has been stabilized for the moment. We have given her medicine to reduce the fever and begun controlling the infection. But, sweetheart, Your mother needs continued treatment. She needs more tests, more medicine, and more time under observation. Hope nodded. Yes, sir. Dr. Warren hesitated for a second, then said the sentence Hope feared most in this world. But there is a problem. The medical bill is already over $4,000. Our clinic needs a deposit of $500 before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning in order to continue treatment. Without that deposit, we will be forced to stop and discharge your mother. Hope's heart dropped. $500. She didn't have $500. She didn't even have $50. Doctor, please, she said, her voice trembling but without tears. Please don't stop treating my mother. I'll get the money. I promise. I promise I will. Dr. Warren looked at her with the eyes of a man who had seen this scene far too many times. Poor families. Patients with no money. Children who should never have had to carry the burden of adult pain. He wanted to help, but he could not. Sweetheart, this is a clinic, not a charity. I have rules I must follow too. I'm very sorry. Hope swallowed. Her throat tasted bitter. Yes, sir, I understand. But please give me until tomorrow morning. I'll bring the money. I promise. Dr. Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock. If there is no money, I will have no choice but to send your mother home. Thank you, doctor, Hope said, her small voice so faint it almost dissolved into the air. Dr. Warren turned and walked out, the door closing gently behind him, leaving Hope alone in the room with nothing but the creaking fan and her mother's fragile breathing. Hope sat back down on the edge of the bed. She looked at her mother's face for a long time. Tears rose into her eyes, but she blinked hard and forced them back. She bent down and kissed her mother's forehead softly. Her mother's skin was burning hot. Don't worry, Mom, she whispered. I'll get the money. I promise you. She stood up, straightened the old dress that was frayed at the shoulders and faded with wear. She looked up at the round clock hanging on the hospital wall. The short hand pointed to 1. The long hand pointed to 12. 1 o'clock in the afternoon. 19 hours left. Hope drew in a deep breath, turned her back on the bed where her mother lay, and walked out of the room on small legs that somehow seemed burdened with the weight of the whole world. The apartment where Hope and her mother lived was not far from the clinic, only about a 15-minute walk. But today, those 15 minutes felt as long as a lifetime. Hope walked along the cracked sidewalk, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her mind spinning around the number $500. She had never seen $500 in her life. She had never even held more than $20 in her hands at one time, but she had promised her mother. And Hope never broke a promise to her mother. When she pushed open the apartment door, the first thing that struck her was not what she saw, but the silence. A frightening, heavy silence that pressed against her chest like a stone. The apartment had only one room, with a tiny kitchen in the corner and a bathroom so cramped it was hard even to turn around. The paint peeled from the walls in large patches. The ceiling was stained with brown marks from rainwater leaking through the winter before. But it was home, the only place in this world where Hope felt safe. Only today, the apartment was missing the one thing that made it feel like home, and that was her mother's voice. Hope stood in the middle of the room and found herself looking toward the little kitchen. Every afternoon, her mother would stand there, arranging flowers into small bundles while she sang. She sang all kinds of songs, sometimes old lullabies, sometimes songs she made up herself. Her voice was not beautiful in the way a singer's voice might be, but to Hope, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. Now the kitchen stood empty. No singing, no laughter, no mother. Hope swallowed the tightness in her throat and turned toward the opposite corner of the room. There, right beside the door, stood a large plastic bucket. Inside it were flowers, the bouquets her mother had cut, trimmed, and tied before her illness became so severe that she could no longer stand. Red roses, yellow daisies, purple lavender. Each bouquet was wrapped carefully in old newspaper and fastened with a rubber band. This was how her mother made a living. Every afternoon, Audrey would carry this bucket of flowers out to the sidewalk, stand at the intersection near their home, and sell them to passers-by. $3 a bouquet, $5 a bouquet. Sometimes, if someone felt sorry for her, they would add another $1 or $2 as a tip. It was never much, but it was enough to buy rice, to buy milk, enough to pay the rent month after month. Hope walked over, knelt beside the bucket, and reached out to touch the rose petals. The petals were still soft, still fragrant, but their edges had already begun to wilt. just like her mother, still there, but fading. She wrapped both hands around the bucket's handle and pulled. It was heavy, far heavier than she had imagined. Her arms shook, her back ached, but she clenched her teeth and dragged the bucket toward the door, little by little, inch by inch. When she reached the doorway, she stopped, panting, then lifted the bucket into her arms. She swayed under the weight, her back bent, her shoulders drooping, but she held on. She stood in the doorway of the apartment and looked outside. The sun had already begun to lean westward, the light turning from a blinding white into a deep gold. She counted in her head. 1:30 in the afternoon. 18.5 hours left. Hope knew she could not go to the familiar streets around here. Her neighbors were poor too, struggling too, fighting their own battles with rent and food. No one had extra money to buy flowers. But there was one place where people had money. A great deal of money. Gold Coast. The richest neighborhood in Chicago. The place where the cars were worth more than the apartment she and her mother lived in. Where the iron gates stood taller than a grown man. Where the flowers in their gardens were probably lovelier than the flowers she was carrying now. But she had no other choice. Hope tightened her grip on the bucket handle, stepped across the threshold of the apartment, and began to walk. Alone, beneath the summer afternoon sun of Chicago. 8 years old, carrying a bucket of flowers almost half her size, walking toward the richest neighborhood in the city to save her mother. It took Hope nearly an hour of walking to reach Gold Coast. Her legs were aching, her shoulders were sore from carrying the bucket of flowers, and sweat ran from her temples down along her neck. But when she turned onto the first street in the wealthy neighborhood, she forgot all about her exhaustion, because everything here was completely different from the world she knew. The streets were spotless, without a single piece of trash. Rows of lush green trees, trimmed with perfect care, stood in even lines along both sides of the sidewalk. Cars were parked along the street, each one gleaming, expensive, and 2 or 3 times the size of the buses Hope was used to riding. And the houses, no, not houses, mansions, with towering iron gates, solid walls built for privacy, and flower gardens larger than the apartment where she and her mother lived. Hope tightened her grip on the bucket of flowers and walked to the first gate she saw. It was a black iron gate, 3 times taller than she was, with pointed tips along the top like the teeth of some animal. She raised her hand and knocked softly. A small panel in the gate slid open, and a large security guard looked down at her. His face tightened as if he had just smelled something unpleasant. "What do you want?" he barked. "Hello, sir," Hope said politely. "I'm selling flowers. Fresh flowers. Would you like to buy some?" The guard let out a mocking laugh. "Are you crazy? Get lost before I call the police. This is not a place for the likes of you." The panel slammed shut. The sound of metal striking metal rang out with a cold finality. Hope stood there for a second, her chest aching sharply, then turned toward the house next door. The second gate was opened by the owner herself, a woman around 40, with perfectly curled blonde hair, a diamond necklace, and a spotless white outfit. She looked Hope up and down, from her messy hair to her old dress worn thin at the shoulders, to her dirty canvas shoes, and her face twisted in disgust. "Why is a filthy little girl standing in front of my gate?" she said in a sharp, icy voice. "Go away. Leave at once. We don't need anything from people like you." Hope didn't even have time to open her mouth before the gate shut in her face. This time, Hope felt her throat tighten, but she swallowed it down, turned away, and walked to the next house. The third gate, a young man, maybe in his 30s, opened it. He looked at Hope, looked at the bucket of flowers, then looked back at Hope. He didn't frown, he didn't shout, he didn't sneer. He asked gently, "Are you selling flowers?" "Yes, sir," Hope said, her voice trembling because she was not used to being spoken to in a normal way. "Fresh flowers. $5 a bouquet." The man looked at the bucket of flowers, then at the small shoulders trembling beneath its weight. He pulled out his wallet, took out a $50 bill, and placed it in Hope's hand. "Keep it. Buy yourself something to eat, and keep the flowers too." Hope looked at the bill in her hand, and for the first time that day, her eyes lit up. "Thank you, sir. Thank you so much." The man nodded, gave her a faint smile, and closed the gate. Hope held the $50 bill against her chest and kept walking. She knocked on more gates. Some houses bought 1 bouquet, some bought 2. Some people added extra tip money without taking any flowers. Some opened the gate and then shut it again at once. Some didn't even bother opening it at all. But Hope didn't stop. She kept walking, kept knocking, kept saying, "I'm selling flowers," in the most polite voice she had. By the middle of the afternoon, Hope stopped beneath a large oak tree by the sidewalk. She sat down on the pavement, set the bucket of flowers beside her feet, then reached into the pocket of her dress and took out the money to count it. One bill at a time, she smoothed each one flat and stacked them neatly together. $180. Hope counted again in her head, still short by $320. She lifted her face and looked at the sky. The sun had already tilted far toward the west, and the sunlight was no longer harsh but had turned a deep golden shade. She got to her feet, lifted the bucket again, and kept going. More gates, more knocks, a few more bouquets sold, a few more refusals. When the sky began to shift from orange to purple, Hope stopped again and counted the money. $340, still short by $160. She looked into the bucket. Fewer than 10 bouquets remained, and many of them had already started to wilt. She lifted her head and looked at the darkening sky. If night fell completely, no one would open the gate for an 8-year-old girl selling flowers anymore. She knew that. Then she saw it. At the end of the street, rising like a fortress, stood the largest mansion Hope had ever seen in her life. Gray stone walls, a massive black iron gate, security cameras mounted everywhere, a long white gravel driveway stretching deep into the property. 2 rows of flowers planted on either side as if standing guard. Something about that house radiated both grandeur and fear, as though it was not simply the home of someone wealthy, but the home of someone no one dared approach. Hope swallowed hard. She looked at the bucket of flowers she had left, then at the mansion, then at the sky with the last of its light fading away. "This is my last chance," she whispered to herself. Then she tightened her grip on the bucket handle and walked toward the last black iron gate at the end of the street. Hope stood before the enormous black iron gate and tilted her head back to look up. The gate was 4 times taller than she was, its black bars rising in rigid lines like the fencing of a prison, each one crowned with a sharp point at the top. Security cameras were mounted in the 2 upper corners, their red lights blinking slowly, like eyes watching every movement. Hope drew in a deep breath, lifted her tiny fist, and knocked against the gate. The sound of metal rang out low and hollow in the fading light of afternoon. A few seconds later, a small panel in the gate swung open. An old face, sour and lined, with silver sideburns and a grim expression, peered down at her from the other side. "What do you want?" he growled. "Hello, sir," Hope said, trying to keep her voice calm even though her heart was pounding. "I'm selling flowers. Fresh flowers. May I speak to the owner of the house, please?" The old guard looked her up and down, then let out a laugh. But it was not the kind of laugh that held any joy. It was the kind of laugh people gave when they heard something so ridiculous they could hardly believe it. "Do you even know who lives here?" he asked, his voice dropping lower, and Hope heard something in it. Not only contempt, fear too. Fear of the very man he was guarding. "This is Damon Kessler's house. Do you understand? Damon Kessler. He does not have time for little street flower sellers. Get out of here. Now." Hope didn't know who Damon Kessler was. She didn't know what weight that name carried in this world. She only knew that she needed $160 more before 8 o'clock the next morning, and this was the last gate on the street. "Sir, please," she said, her voice beginning to tremble. "Just let me try once. I only need $160 more. My mother is very sick. If I do not have the money by tomorrow morning, they will stop treating her." The old guard said nothing. He shut the small panel again. Hope thought that was the end of it. But then the gate opened a crack, and the old guard stepped out with a younger guard behind him. Both of them looked at her the way people looked at a stray cat that had wandered into the wrong place. "Go on, kid," the younger guard said, his tone less harsh but still firm. "This is not a place for you, but I only need—" Hope didn't finish. The old guard seized one of her arms. The younger guard grabbed the other. They dragged her away from the gate. Hope struggled, her shoes scraping across the ground, the bucket of flowers tipping wildly as several blooms spilled onto the white gravel path. "Please, sirs," she cried out, her voice breaking. "Please let me see him. Please. My mother is waiting. My mother will die if I do not get the money." Inside the mansion, some distance beyond the gate, across the gravel drive and the perfectly trimmed flower beds, Damon Kessler was sitting in his study on the second floor. 36 years old, tall, with a face that looked as if it had been carved from stone, sharp features, a square jaw, and gray eyes the color of steel. He was wearing a black suit even though he was at home, the white cuffs of his shirt visible beneath the sleeves, folded back in exactly 2 neat turns. Everything about him spoke of absolute control. He was on the telephone, his voice low and measured, each word landing with the weight of stone. "I do not care what the board says. If they do not agree to my terms by Friday, I walk away from the deal. All of it. No negotiation." As he spoke, his eyes drifted by chance to the large window overlooking the front gate. And then he saw it. 2 guards were dragging a little girl away from the entrance. She was tiny, frail, fighting against them, crying out, clutching a bucket of flowers while blossoms scattered across the ground each time she was jerked too hard. Damon stopped in the middle of the sentence, his hand holding the phone lowered slightly. He stared at the scene, and something in his chest tightened. Not pity, not curiosity, something deeper than that, something stronger, something he could not name, as though an invisible hand had closed around his heart and would not let go. He had seen 100 scenes worse than this in his life without flinching. He had watched grown men fall to their knees at his feet and beg, and his face had never changed. But this child, the way she fought not because she was afraid, but because she refused to give up. The way she held that bucket of flowers as though it were the most precious thing she owned. The way she shouted, "My mother is waiting," in the voice of an 8-year-old child who should never have had to carry anything heavier than a school bag, made it impossible for him to look away. "I will call you back," he said into the phone, and then he ended the call without waiting for the other person to answer. He rose from his chair, stepped out of the study, went down the staircase, crossed the living room, and headed for the front door. The housekeeper standing in the hallway looked at him in surprise. "Where are you going, sir?" "Outside." He didn't slow down. Damon strode down the white gravel path, moving quickly toward the gate. The 2 guards saw their employer coming and immediately released the little girl, standing up straight, their faces gone pale. Hope almost fell when they let go of her so suddenly, but she caught her balance and clutched the bucket of flowers tightly against her chest. Damon stopped a few steps away from her. "What is going on here?" he asked, his voice calm but so heavy that the air around them seemed to thicken. "Sir," the old guard said quickly, stumbling over his words. "This girl came here causing trouble. We were taking her away." Damon didn't look at the guards. He looked at Hope. She stood there, small and thin, in a faded old dress, her eyes red but no longer crying, both arms wrapped around the bucket of flowers pressed to her chest as though it were the only thing keeping her upright. And there, at Damon's feet, on the spotless white gravel, lay a single red rose. It had fallen from the bucket while she was being dragged away. Its petals were slightly bruised, but it was still red, still fresh, still beautiful. Damon looked at the rose by his feet, then looked back at the little girl. He said 2 words, and those 2 words changed everything. "Let her in." The 2 guards opened the gate at once and stepped back to either side, their eyes lowered, not daring to look at their employer. Hope walked through the black iron gate, her feet touching the white gravel path that stretched deep inside, and she felt as though she had just crossed into another world, a world she didn't belong in. Flowers lined both sides of the path in perfect symmetry, every rosebush, every cluster of lavender arranged so evenly it seemed they had been measured with a ruler. The flowers here were 100 times more beautiful than the flowers she was trying to sell. Farther in stood a marble fountain, its water murmuring softly, the last light of evening catching the surface and turning it into shimmering streaks of gold. Damon walked ahead, long strides, back straight. Hope followed behind, taking short steps, her back bent beneath the weight of the bucket in her arms. 2 shadows, one tall and powerful, one small and fragile, stretched over the white gravel beneath the sunset. When Damon pushed open the front door, Hope's mouth parted. She wanted to say something, but no words came out. Inside, the mansion was even more beautiful than it had been from the outside. The floor was polished black marble so glossy that Hope could see her own reflection in it, small and out of place in the vastness around her. Large paintings hung on the walls in gold leaf frames. She didn't understand what the paintings were meant to show, but she knew they must be expensive. A sweeping staircase of black oak curved upward to the 2nd floor, its banister smooth and gleaming. Above, from the soaring ceiling, hung an enormous crystal chandelier. Hundreds of tiny pieces of crystal suspended in the air, breaking the light into 1,000 glittering points across the room. Everything was black, gray, and white, cold, luxurious, perfect, and distant, completely unlike the damp apartment with peeling walls and a leaking ceiling where she and her mother lived. Hope held the bucket of flowers tighter against her chest, afraid that the damp petals might drip water onto the costly marble floor. She walked softly, as if afraid the sound of her own footsteps might shatter the silence of this house. The faint scent of oak and leather lingered in the air, a smell Hope had never known before, unfamiliar yet somehow pleasant, the smell of wealth she had only ever known from behind closed gates. Damon led her into the large sitting room and pointed to a black leather chair. "Sit there," he said. His voice was still low, still brief, but it no longer carried the same hard edge it had when he was on the phone. Something in his voice had changed from the moment he saw the little girl being dragged at the gate, though even he didn't realize it. Hope sat on the edge of the chair, her back straight, her feet swinging above the floor without touching it. The bucket of flowers placed carefully at her feet, both hands resting on her lap. She sat there like the best-behaved child in the world, afraid to touch anything, afraid to dirty anything. Damon stood across from her and looked at her. Then he asked, his voice slower than usual, "What is your name?" "My name is Hope, sir." "Hope," he repeated, as though weighing the name on his tongue. "How old are you?" "I'm 8 years old, sir." 8 years old, he said, his voice softer. "Then tell me, why is an 8-year-old child selling flowers alone in Gold Coast at almost evening?" Hope looked down at her hands, then lifted her eyes to his. Her eyes were clear, sorrowful, but not weak. "My mother is very sick. She's at the clinic. The doctor said that if we don't have $500 as a deposit before 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, they will stop treating her. I sold flowers all afternoon and I already made $340. I only need $160 more." She spoke each sentence clearly and slowly, as though she had practiced saying it in her head all day. Damon was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Where is your father?" Hope didn't hesitate. The answer had lived inside her for a very long time, familiar as an old scar that no longer hurt but never disappeared. "My father died before I was born, sir. It's only my mother and me." The great room suddenly fell into a silence so deep it was hard to breathe inside it. Damon looked at the 8-year-old child sitting on the black leather chair, the flowers at her feet slowly wilting, in the middle of the sitting room of the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago. He had seen hundreds of men fall to their knees before him and beg. He had seen women cry and plead in front of him. He had seen rivals tremble at the sound of his name. But never, not once in his life, had he felt what he felt now. This child should have been outside playing. She should have been in a classroom. She should have been in her mother's arms listening to fairy tales before sleep, not carrying a bucket of flowers from gate to gate in the richest part of the city, begging strangers to save her mother. Something broke inside Damon. He could not name it. He only knew that his chest hurt, and that pain had nothing to do with the body. "Sit here and wait," he said, his voice gentler than it had been at any moment that day. "I'll help you." Hope's eyes widened. "Really?" "Yes. Stay still. Don't touch anything." Then Damon turned and walked toward the study at the end of the hallway to get the money. Hope sat on the black leather chair, her feet swinging gently, her hands folded neatly on her lap. She didn't dare move. She didn't dare touch anything. She felt like a stain in the middle of this immaculate room. Her faded old dress, her dusty canvas shoes, the bucket of flowers slowly wilting at her feet, all of it painfully out of place among marble and crystal. She sat still, listening to the sound of Damon's footsteps fading toward the end of the hallway, and then silence. The sitting room was too large, the ceiling too high, the quiet too deep. Hope began to look around, not out of curiosity, but because she didn't know where else to look besides the image of her mother lying in the hospital. The image that kept rising before her eyes whenever she blinked. Her gaze passed over the paintings on the wall, over the crystal chandelier, over the winding staircase, and then stopped at the far end of the hallway. The door to Damon's study was not fully closed. It stood slightly ajar, just enough for the warm light inside to spill out in a narrow golden strip across the black marble floor. Hope didn't mean to look inside. She knew he had told her not to touch anything, and she was a child who knew how to obey. But her eyes, the eyes of an 8-year-old child, still curious about the world, drifted on their own through that narrow opening. Inside, she saw a large room, its walls paneled in dark oak, tall bookshelves reaching from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound books, a great heavy wooden desk in the center, papers and pens arranged on top of it, and a desk lamp casting a warm yellow glow. Damon was standing on the far side of the desk, his back to the door, opening a drawer. But Hope was not looking at Damon. Her eyes were pulled elsewhere, to the wall directly behind the desk. There, hanging in a place of honor on the oak-paneled wall, was a large photograph set inside a black wooden frame. It was bigger than any photograph Hope had ever seen, almost as large as a window, taking up nearly the entire wall behind the desk. And in that photograph was a young woman, a woman with light brown hair blowing softly in the wind, with the brightest smile anyone could possibly have in this world, with green eyes so luminous they looked as though sunlight lived inside them. She was wearing a long white dress, standing before a vast lake, with a sunset blazing behind her in streaks of red, orange, and violet. The wind lifted her hair across her shoulders, and she was smiling at the person taking the photograph, smiling as though the whole world was good and nothing in it could ever be frightening. Hope looked at the photograph, and her heart stopped, not in the figurative sense. Her heart truly stopped for one beat, then began pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She knew that face. She knew that smile. She knew those eyes. She saw that face every morning when she woke up. She saw that face every night before she went to sleep. She held that face when she cried. She kissed that face when she was afraid. It was her mother. The woman in the photograph was her mother. Audrey, younger, brighter, more beautiful than Hope had ever seen her, because Hope had only known her mother with a tired, gaunt face, selling flowers on the street. But it was her mother. There was no mistaking it. There could never be any mistake. Hope rose from the chair. She no longer remembered what he had told her. She no longer remembered that she was supposed to sit still. She no longer remembered that she was supposed to be good. Her legs moved on their own, as if drawn by an invisible thread, across the sitting room, down the hallway, until she stood before the half-open door to the study. She pushed it farther open and stepped inside. She walked past the great wooden desk and stopped directly in front of the photograph. She had to tilt her head back because it hung far above her. She stood there, small and fragile, before the enormous photograph, head lifted, mouth parted, eyes wide, her arms hanging at her sides like a child standing before a miracle, and not knowing whether the miracle was real or a dream. "That's my mother," she whispered. Her voice trembled so much it was almost soundless, no more than breath shaped into language, so light that even the faintest breeze might have carried it away. But Damon heard it. He was standing on the far side of the desk, a wallet in his hand that he had just taken from the drawer. He heard that whisper, and he turned around. He saw Hope standing before the photograph, the small child before the large portrait, and for the first time, he saw what he had not fully seen at the gate, what he had not truly noticed in the sitting room. Two faces. The face of the woman in the photograph and the face of the child standing before it. The same lines, the same nose, the same shape of the mouth, the same way the eyes narrowed slightly when emotion rose too high. So alike it was almost frightening, as though this child were a smaller living copy of the woman in the photograph. "Hope," Damon said, and his voice trembled without meaning to, something that had never happened before. "What are you doing in here?" Hope turned and looked at him. Her eyes were full of tears, bright beneath the desk lamp, her lips trembling, and she asked in the voice of an 8-year-old child who didn't understand what was happening to her world. "Sir, why is there a picture of my mother in your house?" Damon went still. The wallet slipped from his hand and fell onto the wooden desk with a soft thud. But he didn't hear it. He heard nothing anymore. In his ears, only one phrase echoed again and again. "My mother, my mother." "What did you just say?" he asked, his voice rough and raw. "That picture," Hope said, lifting her hand toward the wall. "That's my mother. My mother's name is Audrey. Why do you have a picture of my mother?" Audrey. The name rang through the room like a bell striking the center of Damon's chest. Audrey, the woman he had searched for during 9 long years. The woman who vanished in a single night without goodbye. The woman he had sent people across the country to find and had never found. The woman whose photograph he had kept on the wall of his study for 9 years, looking at it every day, every single day, because he refused to believe she was dead, refused to believe she had forgotten him, refused to believe she would never come back. And now this child, this little girl selling flowers, stood before that photograph and called the woman in it her mother. Damon Kessler, the Mafia boss feared by the entire Chicago underworld, the man whose enemies turned and fled at the sight of him, felt his knees weaken. He lifted a hand to cover his mouth. He turned his face away. His shoulders trembled, his back bent, and he cried. Not with sound, not with sobs, only with tears slipping through the fingers covering his mouth, falling to the oak floor one drop at a time. The room was silent to the point of pain. There was only the steady ticking of the wall clock and the unsteady, shuddering breath of the most powerful man in Chicago, standing with his back to an 8-year-old child, crying over a name he had believed he would never hear again. Hope stood there, frightened, confused, unable to understand what was happening. She had asked only one question. Why is there a picture of my mother here? Why is this man crying? At that very moment, right in the middle of the instant when Damon stood with his back turned, trying to swallow the sound of his own grief, and Hope stood trembling before the photograph, unable to understand what was happening, a woman's voice cut through the room like a blade slicing through silk. What is going on here? The voice was cold. Not cold in the way Damon's voice had been cold on the telephone. Cold in another way. Cold like ice that had frozen solid long ago. Cold to the point that it no longer held any possibility of melting. Hope spun around at once. Damon turned too, quickly wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Standing in the doorway of the study was a woman. She was tall, rigid, straight as a ruler, without a single soft curve in her figure or in her face. Her white silver hair was pinned up in a perfect knot without one strand out of place. Her cheekbones were sharp and high. Her eyes were narrow like a hawk's. Her lips were a thin, straight line. She wore black from head to toe, clothing expensive down to the buttons and the heels of her shoes, the kind of expensive that didn't need to show itself, because one glance was enough to tell no one would dare ask the price. This was Constance Kessler, Damon's mother, 64 years old, and her face at that moment looked like a death sentence. Her eyes swept across the room in less than 2 seconds, but those 2 seconds were enough for her to see everything. She saw Hope, the dirty little girl in the old dress standing in her son's study. She saw the photograph on the wall, the photograph she knew very well, the photograph she had wanted Damon to take down long ago, but he never would. She saw Damon's red eyes, the slight tremor still in his shoulders, the hand that had just wiped away tears in haste. And she understood, instantly, without needing a word of explanation. Her face gave the faintest flicker, no more than 1/10 of a second, brief enough that no one else would have noticed. Then she mastered it again, pulling it back into its perfect coldness, like lowering an iron mask over her features. She looked at Hope with the kind of eyes people reserved for vermin that had found their way into the house. "Who is this filthy child?" she asked, her voice not raised at all, yet every word sliced. "Why is she standing in my son's study?" Damon tried to regain control of himself. "Mother, this is... I do not care who she is," Constance cut in, sharp and clean as a paper knife. "Throw her out. Now." Hope stepped back once, her back nearly touching the wall beneath the photograph. She looked at this woman, and the instinct of an 8-year-old child told her at once that this was someone dangerous. Not dangerous in the way the guards at the gate had been dangerous when they shouted at her. Dangerous in another way, a real way, the kind she could feel in her bones and her skin, and in the way the woman stood, the way she looked, the way she spoke each word as though counting bullets before firing them. Constance stepped into the room, her eyes fixed on Hope, then flicked up toward the photograph, then back to Hope again. She looked at the child's face, and she saw what Damon had just seen, the resemblance, so strong it nearly made her sick, but she didn't show it. She only clenched her jaw slightly, then said in a voice so calm it became cruel, "This child is a liar. She saw the photograph on the wall and made up a story. She wants to trick you out of money." "Don't be a fool, Damon. I'm not lying," Hope cried, tears beginning to spill. "That really is my mother. My mother's name is Audrey. I'm not tricking anybody. Be quiet," Constance snapped. She didn't scream. She snapped, brief, sharp, cold, like the crack of a whip through the air. Hope shrank in on herself. Then Constance stepped forward and seized Hope's arm. Her hand was dry, bony, hard, and she gripped so tightly that Hope winced in pain. She dragged Hope out of the study. "Mother, stop," Damon said, following after them. But Constance didn't listen. She pulled Hope down the hallway, through the sitting room, moving fast and with absolute purpose, each step of her shoes striking the marble floor like nails being hammered into place. Hope was dragged along, her feet scraping across the floor, struggling as best she could, but the woman's grip was too strong. "Ma'am, I'm not lying. She really is my mother," Hope sobbed. Constance didn't turn around. She didn't look at her. She didn't answer. She shoved open the front door, pulled Hope down the front steps, across the white gravel path, and toward the gate. Damon ran after them, but Constance shouted before he could come close. "Throw this girl out," she ordered the 2 guards standing near the entrance. "Immediately, and if I ever see her here again, you both lose your jobs." The guards hurried forward. The older one grabbed one of Hope's arms. The younger one seized the other. They dragged her toward the gate so quickly that her feet almost stopped touching the ground. "Please, sirs, I didn't do anything wrong. I was only selling flowers. I only asked one question," Hope cried, struggling, sobbing, calling out, but the gate was already open. The guards shoved her outside. Hope stumbled over the step beyond the gate and fell hard onto the sidewalk. Both knees struck the ground at once, the skin tearing open, blood rising immediately, bright red against the gray concrete. The bucket of flowers that Hope had carried all the way from home, had held onto through so many slammed gates, had clutched through so many insults, flew from her hands, tipped over, and spilled everywhere. Red rose petals fell onto the white gravel. Yellow daisies landed face up on the pavement. Purple lavender rolled beneath the iron gate. The flowers her mother had cut and trimmed and bundled so carefully before sickness had made her too weak to stand, now lay scattered across the ground like broken dreams. The black iron gate slammed shut behind Hope. The sound of metal striking metal rang out one last time, heavy and final, like the sound of a door closing forever. Hope sat on the sidewalk. Her knees were bleeding. Flowers lay strewn around her. The money was still in the pocket of her dress, but her heart was shattered. She didn't understand what she had done wrong. She had only asked one question. Only one. "Why is there a picture of my mother in your house?" She sat there and cried. Truly cried. For the first time that day, she cried without being able to stop. Tears streamed down her dusty cheeks and fell onto her bleeding knees, red and clear mingling together. She cried because it hurt, because she was frightened, because she didn't understand, because the world of grown people was too cruel to an 8-year-old child who only wanted to save her mother. But then she stopped. She wiped her tears away with the back of her dirty hand. She drew in a deep breath, shaking, broken, uneven. She looked at the flowers scattered across the ground, bent down, and gathered the ones that were not crushed, the ones that could still be saved, and put them back into the bucket. She stood up, limping now because her knees throbbed with pain. She looked into the distance, toward the clinic, toward the place where her mother was waiting. "My mother is waiting," she whispered. Then she lifted the bucket, now half empty, turned her back on the black iron gate, and walked away, limping, slowly, but without stopping. By the time Hope made it back to the clinic, night had fallen completely. The weak yellow streetlights cast her shadow long across the cracked sidewalk, a tiny limping shadow dragging a nearly empty bucket of flowers. Her legs ached so badly that every step required her to grit her teeth. Her left knee had swollen, and the blood had dried into a dark brown crust on her skin. But each time she bent it, the crust split, and fresh blood seeped through again. Her arms were sore. Her shoulders throbbed. Her fingers had gone stiff from gripping the bucket handle all day long. But she didn't stop. She walked straight through the clinic doors, down the hallway flooded with cold white light, and to the reception desk where a nurse sat writing notes. Hope set the bucket down on the floor, reached into the pocket of her dress, pulled out the crumpled wad of money, and placed it on the counter. "Ma'am, this is the hospital money for my mother. My mother's name is Audrey Sinclair." The nurse looked at Hope, looked at the knee that was still bleeding, looked at the torn and dirty dress, and then looked at the money. She counted slowly, one bill at a time, smoothing each one flat, stacking them neatly. Then she looked up and shook her head. $340. You're still short 160 more. Sweetheart, it's not enough. Hope knew. She had counted it over and over on the way back. She knew exactly how much was missing, but hearing someone else say that number aloud still made a sharp pain cut through her chest. "Ma'am, please just take this for now," Hope said, her voice rough and hoarse because she had not had any water all day. "I'll bring the rest in the morning. I promise." I'll earn enough. Please don't stop treating my mother." The nurse looked at her. She was not cruel. She was only someone working for a living in an underfunded clinic. The kind of place where every day she had to witness stories like this more often than she wanted to. She sighed, looked down at the money, then back at the 8-year-old child standing in front of her with a bleeding knee and red swollen eyes that still were not crying. "All right," she said softly. "I'll take this for now. But tomorrow morning before 8 o'clock, you have to bring the rest. If you don't, the clinic won't be able to keep your mother here." "Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you so much." Hope lowered her head, then turned to look at the clock hanging on the wall behind the reception desk. 8 o'clock at night. 12 hours left. She picked up the bucket of flowers and ran down the hallway toward her mother's room, limping badly but still forcing herself to run. When she pushed open the door to the room, she stopped. Her mother was awake. Audrey was sitting propped up against the pillows, weak, her face still pale, her lips still dry, one hand trembling faintly on top of the bedsheet. But her eyes were open, and those eyes lit up the instant she saw Hope standing in the doorway. "Hope," Audrey called, her voice hoarse and weak but warm. "Where have you been all day? I was so worried." Hope stood in the doorway for exactly 1 second, then ran to the bed and threw herself into her mother's arms. The bucket of flowers fell to the floor again, but this time she didn't care. She held her mother so tightly that Audrey gave a soft cough of pain, but she didn't push her away. Audrey held her daughter back, one trembling hand stroking through Hope's tangled, dust-covered hair, and the two of them stayed like that in the tiny hospital room that smelled of disinfectant, beneath the pale white light, saying nothing. Then Audrey gently pulled Hope back and put both hands on her shoulders, looking her up and down. Audrey's eyes stopped at the torn dress, at the dirt all over her body, and then lingered longest on Hope's left knee, where dried blood and fresh blood were smeared together across the skin. "Hope," Audrey said, her voice beginning to shake. "What happened to you? Why is your knee bleeding? Why is your dress torn?" Hope sat down on the edge of the bed, drew in a deep breath, and began to tell her everything. She told it slowly, from the beginning. She told her mother how she went home and took the bucket of flowers her mother had already tied. She told her how she walked nearly an hour to Gold Coast. She told her about the first guard who shouted at her and threatened to call the police. She told her about the rich woman who called her filthy. She told her about the kind young man who gave her $50 and said, "Keep it and buy yourself something to eat." She told her about the gates that opened and then closed, the faces that showed pity and then contempt, the money she counted again and again beneath the tree. Audrey lay there listening, tears slipping silently down her pale cheeks. She didn't interrupt her daughter. She let her tell everything. With every sentence Hope spoke, Audrey's heart broke a little more, because she knew her daughter was 8 years old and should never have had to endure any of it. Then Hope came to the last part. "And then I saw the biggest mansion at the end of the street, Mom. It was huge. A black iron gate. Cameras everywhere. The guards wouldn't let me in, and they were dragging me away. But then a man came out. He was tall, with gray eyes, and he was wearing a black suit. The guards called him Damon Kessler." When Audrey heard that name, her hand clenched tightly around the bedsheet, but Hope didn't notice. She kept going. "He let me into the house, Mom. He asked me how old I was, and why I was selling flowers. I told him about you. He said he was going to help me." Hope paused for 1 second. Then she looked at her mother, her clear eyes wide, and her voice dropped to a whisper. "But Mom, while I was waiting, I saw a picture in his study. It was a very big picture, hanging on the wall." Audrey stopped breathing. "Mom," Hope said, her voice trembling, "it was a picture of you. You were wearing a white dress, standing in front of a huge lake, at sunset. You were smiling. You looked so beautiful." Audrey said nothing. "Mom," Hope asked, her eyes looking straight into her mother's, "why is there a picture of you in that man's house?" Audrey didn't answer, not because she had not heard her daughter's question, but because that question struck the deepest, darkest, most painful place inside her chest, the place she had spent 9 years burying and pretending didn't exist. Audrey's face changed from pale to utterly white, whiter than the bedsheet, whiter than she had been even when she collapsed from the illness, as if all the blood in her body had drained away in a single second. Her hands began to shake, not a slight tremor, a violent shaking, hard enough that the bedsheet wrinkled beneath the fingers clutching it. Then she lifted both hands to cover her mouth, and a broken sob escaped through her fingers. It was not the ordinary sound of crying. It was the cry of someone who had just been stabbed straight through an old wound they had thought was healed. "No," Audrey whispered through tears. "No, no, no, no." Hope panicked. She had never seen her mother like this. Her mother had cried before. Yes, cried quietly at night when she thought Hope was asleep. Cried when she counted the money at the end of the month and it was not enough to pay the rent. Cried when she was too sick and they had no money for medicine. But never like this. Never in this way. With her whole body trembling, her eyes wide with terror, as though she had just seen the most horrifying thing in the world rise up in front of her. "Mom," Hope said, and now her own voice was beginning to tremble too. "What's wrong? Are you hurting? I'll call the doctor." "No." Audrey grabbed Hope's hand and held it so tightly that the child winced. Audrey's eyes locked onto her daughter's, red-rimmed and frantic, and in them Hope saw something she had never seen in her mother before. Fear. Real fear. "Hope, listen to me," Audrey said, her voice shaking but urgent. "We have to leave. Tonight. Right now. We have to leave Chicago. We have to go far away. Somewhere they will never find us." "Leave?" Hope stammered. "But you're sick. The doctor said you need treatment. You still haven't." "I don't care what the doctor said," Audrey cut in, her voice turning high and sharp with panic. "I need you alive. Do you understand? I need you safe. Nothing matters more than that." Hope stared at her mother, her lips parting but no words coming at first. She didn't understand. She didn't understand any of this. Only a few minutes ago she had asked about the photograph, about why her mother was on the wall in a stranger's house. And now her mother was crying, shaking, saying they had to flee the city in the middle of the night. "Who are they, Mom?" Hope asked, her voice smaller now. "You said they can't find us. Who are they? You're scaring me." Audrey looked at her daughter, looked at that small face full of fear because she understood nothing, looked at those clear eyes begging for an explanation. And Audrey knew she could not keep running forever. Not because her body was too weak, but because her daughter deserved the truth. She had lied to her child for 8 years. 8 years of saying your father is dead. 8 years of hiding everything. And now, after Hope had walked by accident into that very house, had seen that very photograph, had met that very man, the lie could not be held together any longer. Audrey let go of Hope's hand and lifted a hand to wipe away her tears. But the tears kept falling too fast to wipe away. She drew in a deep breath, shaky and broken, then looked straight into her daughter's eyes. "Hope," she said, her voice so choked that every word had to be forced out. "The man you met today? The man in that mansion? Damon Kessler?" She stopped, swallowed hard. Tears slipped over the corner of her mouth. "He is your father." Hope's world stopped, not slowly, all at once, as if someone had ripped the plug from the wall, and every light had gone dark in the same instant. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. She didn't move. She only stared at her mother, lips parted, as if the sentence she had just heard belonged to another planet, another language she could not translate. Then slowly, very slowly, like someone waking from a dream, she spoke. "What?" Her voice was so small it was barely sound at all. "He is your father, Hope." "But," Hope said, and her voice broke in the middle of the word. "But you said my father was dead. You always said he died before I was born." Audrey sobbed again. Her whole body shook on the narrow clinic bed. "I lied," she whispered, her voice full of a pain so raw it sounded as though she were tearing herself apart. "I lied to you. For 8 years. I had to lie to protect you." Hope stared at her mother, eyes wide, tears beginning to gather but not yet wiped away. "Protect me from what?" she asked. "From who?" Audrey looked at her daughter. She knew the time had come. 9 years of silence. 9 years of lies. 9 years of living in fear. Tonight, in this tiny hospital room, beneath the pale white light, with the wall clock ticking down the seconds, the truth had to be spoken. Audrey took both of her daughter's hands and held them tightly, as if she feared that if she let go, Hope would disappear the way Audrey herself had disappeared from Damon's life 9 years before. "Sit down here, sweetheart," Audrey said, her voice a little steadier now, though that steadiness was as fragile as a sheet of thin ice on a lake, ready to shatter under the slightest step. "I need to tell you a story I should have told you a very long time ago." Audrey drew in a deep breath, closed her eyes for 1 second, then opened them again. Her gaze drifted far away, through the hospital wall, through time itself, back to 9 years earlier, where everything had begun and where everything had also ended. 9 years ago, she began, her voice soft and slow, as though speaking too quickly would make the memories hurt more. I was 18. I had no one in this world, Hope. No father, no mother, no brothers or sisters, no relatives. I was an orphan. I grew up in foster care, came into the world alone, and lived alone. I only finished high school, then went to work. I got a job as a bartender at a bar inside a luxury hotel in downtown Chicago. The hotel was enormous, beautiful. Rich people came there all the time. I was happy just to have work, to have a paycheck, to be able to rent a room, to save a little money, and maybe one day go back to school. Audrey paused for a second, and a small smile appeared on her lips, fragile as a flower petal about to fall. But it was real, the smile of someone remembering the most beautiful moment of her life. Then one night, a man walked into the bar. He was tall, handsome, 27 years old. Gray eyes, black hair, a black suit. One look at him, and you knew he was rich. You knew he was powerful. You knew he belonged to a world I would never have dared step into. But he was different, Hope, different from every rich man I had ever served. Most of them looked at me the way people look at an object, like I was nothing more than a machine pouring drinks. But he looked at me and smiled. He asked me my name. He asked me how my day had been. He asked me as though I were a person, not a servant. "Is that my father, Mom?" Hope asked softly. "Yes," Audrey said with a nod. "That was Damon. Your father," Audrey went on. "Damon began coming to the bar more often. Every time he came, he stopped at the counter and talked to me. He asked about my dreams, about my family, about my life. I told him everything honestly, that I was an orphan, that I had no one, that I was working simply to survive and hoping one day to go back to school. He didn't look at me with pity the way other people did. He looked at her with respect, with a warmth I had never received from anyone before. Then we began seeing each other outside the hotel. He took me to restaurants I had only ever seen in movies. He took her to the shore of Lake Michigan at sunset, where the sun sank behind the water and the sky burned red and orange and violet. It was there, by the lake, with the wind lifting her hair, that he raised his camera and took that photograph. The photograph you saw hanging on his wall. Audrey smiled through her tears as she remembered that moment. Then one day, he said 4 words to me that I had never heard anyone say before. Audrey continued, and her voice softened. He said, "Audrey, I don't care where you come from, whether you have a family or not, whether you have a degree or not. I love you because you are the most genuine person I have ever met in my life." Hope listened, her eyes wide, tears slipping silently down her cheeks without her even noticing. "Did you really love him, Mom?" she asked in a whisper. Audrey looked at her daughter, a sad smile on her lips. "Very much, sweetheart. More than anything else in the world. Except for you. You are the one thing I loved more." Hope said nothing. She swallowed her tears. Audrey continued. "We were in love for almost a year. It was the happiest year of my life. Then one day, I began feeling nauseous, dizzy, exhausted. I went to the doctor, and the doctor told me I was pregnant. I was terrified. 18 years old, an orphan, with nothing to her name, and pregnant. But when I told Damon, he was not afraid. He was happy. So happy that he lifted me off the ground, spun me around, and laughed louder than I had ever heard him laugh. He said, 'Audrey, this is the best news of my life. We are going to be a family.' Then Damon said he wanted to introduce me to his mother. He wanted to tell me about the baby, about their plan to marry. I was worried. I knew his mother was a powerful woman, but Damon kept saying, 'Don't worry, my mother will love you the way I do.' But she didn't love me," Audrey said, and suddenly her voice changed, from soft to bitter. The day Damon brought Audrey to meet his mother, Constance looked her up and down with eyes Audrey would never forget. There was not a trace of warmth in those eyes, not a trace of curiosity, only calculation, judgment, and contempt. She asked where Audrey came from. Audrey said she was an orphan. She asked what Audrey's parents had done. Audrey said they had died. She asked whether Audrey had a college degree. Audrey said she had only finished high school. She asked what Audrey did for work. Audrey said she bartended at the hotel. Then Constance laughed. A cold laugh. Brief. Sharp. So you expect me to accept an orphaned girl with no degree, no family, no pedigree, tending bar in a hotel, as the wife of my son, the heir to the Kessler family? Damon became furious. He said, "Mother, I love her. I will marry her whether you agree or not." Constance was silent for a moment. Then she smiled, the coldest smile Audrey had ever seen on a human face. "Very well, Damon. If that is what you want, I won't stand in your way." Damon was overjoyed. He thought his mother had accepted it. But Audrey didn't believe her. Audrey looked straight into Constance's eyes at the exact moment she said those words. And she saw it. She saw something hidden behind that smile. Something dark, dangerous, like a snake coiled up and waiting. "Did she hate you?" Hope asked, her voice trembling. Audrey looked at her daughter. "From the very first second, sweetheart. From the very first second she laid eyes on me." Audrey tightened her grip on Hope's hands, as though if she let go, her daughter would be pulled away into the dark. Her voice dropped low, almost to a whisper, because the next part of the story was the part she had never told anyone, the part she had buried deepest, the part that hurt the most. "That night," Audrey said, "after Damon took me back to my little rented room, I went to bed. I was so happy, because I thought everything was going to be all right, because Damon said his mother had agreed. But around midnight, there was a knock on the door." Audrey swallowed hard. Her throat closed as though an unseen hand were tightening around it. I opened the door, and standing outside my room was Constance, alone. No driver, no bodyguard, just her, standing there in the dark hallway, dressed in black from head to toe, looking at me with the eyes of someone staring at an animal about to be slaughtered. Hope clutched her mother's hand harder. She could feel her own stomach knotting. She walked into my room without asking permission. Audrey went on. She looked around at the room, at the old bed, at the few clothes hanging on the wall, at the tiny stove in the corner, and she looked at all of it with disgust, as if merely standing in that room had stained her. Then Constance turned to Audrey, and she spoke. "Listen carefully," Audrey repeated, her voice shaking, but every word clear, because she remembered every single one, remembered them in a way that would never leave her as long as she lived. "Stay away from my son. Immediately. Disappear. If you do not leave, I will kill the child in your womb. And if you think I am joking, test me. The Kessler family has made people disappear before without anyone ever knowing. You would not be the first, and you would not be the last." Hope covered her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "I told her I loved Damon," Audrey continued, tears streaming down her face. "I told her I was not with him for money. I told her I truly loved him." But Constance didn't listen. She stepped closer to me, close enough that I could smell the expensive perfume she was wearing, and then she said more. But this time her voice was different, no longer simply cold, bitter, hurt, as though she were speaking out of a wound so old it had never healed. "My husband," she said, "Damon's father, once loved a woman from outside our world too, another pale, pretty girl with sweet words and promises of love, and that girl almost destroyed everything. She almost took the Kessler fortune. She almost drove this family into ruin. I had to use every method available to save this dynasty, and I will never allow that to happen again. Never." Audrey looked into Constance's eyes at the very moment she said those words, and Audrey understood. She understood that Constance was not merely a cruel woman. She was a woman devoured by fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of being betrayed again. Fear that had lived inside her for decades, until it had turned her into something monstrous. But understanding didn't make Audrey less afraid. She looked into those eyes and knew with the deepest survival instinct inside her body, that this was not an empty threat. The Kesslers were Mafia. They had power, money, men who obeyed. They truly could make an orphaned 18-year-old girl disappear, and no one in the world would ever ask why. "She wanted to kill me?" Hope asked, her voice breaking, tears soaking the hospital blanket. Audrey pulled her daughter into her arms and held her tightly, one hand stroking through her hair, her lips pressed to the top of the child's head. "I would not let her," Audrey whispered. "I will never let anyone touch you." "Then I'll tell you the rest. That night, after Constance left, I didn't go back to sleep. I sat on the bed with both hands resting over my stomach, where you were growing inside me, and I cried. I didn't cry because I feared for herself. I cried because I feared for the unborn child. Then I stood up. I took the only old backpack I owned and stuffed it with a few clothes, the little money I had saved, and her identification papers. I didn't call Damon. I didn't write a letter. I didn't send a message, not one word of goodbye, because I knew that if I told him, he would try to stop me from leaving. He would try to stand against his mother. And at that time he was only 27, still young, still bound to her in ways he didn't fully understand. Constance would have crushed them both. Or worse, I would have had the baby killed before the child ever had the chance to be born. So I chose. I chose to vanish. I went to a small town outside Chicago, rented the cheapest room I could find, lived on almost nothing, and gave birth to you alone in a tiny clinic. No friends, no family, no Damon, only me and a newborn baby in my arms. 2 years later, I returned to Chicago because I thought enough time had passed, enough distance, enough silence, enough for us to forget. I changed our last name to Sinclair. I stayed far away from Gold Coast. I sold flowers on the street to survive. And I told you that her father had died before she was born. Audrey looked at her daughter, both hands cupping Hope's small, tear-drenched face. I chose you, Hope, Audrey said, her voice breaking but steady. I chose your life over my love. I chose poverty rather than let you be in danger. I chose to lie rather than let you know the truth and be found. Audrey stopped and drew in a shaking breath. And now, sweetheart, they have seen you. She saw your face. She won't stop. That is why we have to leave. Tonight, before they come here. Audrey had not even finished telling the story before she tried to sit up, her hand gripping the side rail of the bed, her trembling feet touching the cold floor. She pulled Hope with her, her voice urgent and panicked. Get up, sweetheart. Grab your things. We have to leave now. Right now. But before she could stand fully, footsteps sounded in the hallway outside. Not the footsteps of a nurse, not the footsteps of a doctor. These were heavy footsteps, decisive, fast, urgent. The footsteps of someone who had run a great distance for a very long time and had finally reached the place he needed to find. Then the hospital room door opened, and Damon Kessler stood there. He no longer looked like the man Hope had met that afternoon. His perfect black suit was now wrinkled, the top button of his white shirt undone, his tie gone somewhere along the way. His hair was disheveled, as though he had run his hands through it 100 times. And his eyes, those gray eyes cold as steel, were now red and swollen, like the eyes of a man who had cried for hours and still could not stop. Behind him, standing a few steps away in the hallway, was Briggs, his chief bodyguard, massive, expressionless, standing as still as a wall. And behind Briggs was Dr. Warren, dragged from sleep in the middle of the night, his face heavy with fatigue and concern. Damon didn't look at anyone else. His eyes were fixed only on Audrey, only on her, the woman standing beside the hospital bed, one hand gripping the rail, her face drained white, her eyes full of horror, her lips trembling. 9 years. For 9 years he had searched for her. For 9 years he had sent men across the country. For 9 years he had looked at the photograph on his wall every day and wondered whether she was alive or dead. And now she was here, in a cheap clinic on the outskirts of Chicago. Thin, pale, seriously ill, but alive. She was alive. Audrey, he said. Just one word. But all 9 years of suffering, all 9 years of searching, all 9 years of sleeplessness and longing were inside that single name. His voice broke. It's really you. Audrey stepped back until her body struck the bed frame. Her eyes widened in panic. The exact fear she had lived with for 9 years now standing in front of her in human form. Damon, you have to go, she said, her voice sharp with terror. You have to leave right now. Don't stay here. Please, leave. Damon stepped into the room, every footstep heavy. Audrey, I've been searching for you for 9 years. 9 years. Do you have any idea what those 9 years did to me? How many nights I stayed awake staring at that photograph on the wall and wondering where you were? How many times I sent people searching from east to west and found not a trace of you? You vanished, Audrey. You vanished as though you had never existed in this world. Damon, please, Audrey said, tears running down her face. Go. For Hope. For our daughter. Damon heard the words, our daughter, and his feet seemed nailed to the floor. He closed his eyes, drew in one deep breath. That breath hurt like swallowing glass. No, he said, opening his eyes again. No more running. No more hiding. I need to understand. Why did you leave? Why did you take my daughter away? Why did you leave me to live 9 years in hell without knowing I had a child? Silence. The steady beep of the monitor in the room. The ticking of the clock. Audrey's labored breathing. Then she spoke. Softly, clearly, one word at a time, like drops of blood falling. Because your mother threatened to kill our child. Damon froze. His entire body froze, as though someone had sucked all the air out of the room and he could no longer breathe. The hospital room fell utterly silent. Even Briggs, standing in the hallway, stopped breathing. What? Damon whispered. Audrey told him everything. She told him about the night Constance came to her room, alone, near midnight, the way she entered without permission, the way she looked around the poor little room with disgust, the way she said, "I will kill the child in your womb." The way she said the Kessler family had made people disappear before. Every sentence, every word, every detail. Damon's face changed with every passing second. Shock. Then pain. Then a deeper pain. The kind of pain that leaves no wound on the skin but tears the inside of a person apart. Then rage. His jaw clenched so hard the tendons in his neck stood out. Both hands curled into fists, so tight his knuckles turned white. Then he turned and drove his fist straight into the hospital wall. Hard. With all his strength. The crash echoed down the hallway. The wall cracked. Plaster dust fell in a fine shower. Blood appeared across his right hand. The skin split over the knuckles. But he didn't look at it. He didn't feel it. The pain inside his chest was greater by 1,000 lifetimes than any wound on flesh could ever be. What did my mother do? His voice was not a question. It was a roar caught in the throat of a wounded beast. Then his legs gave way. The most powerful mafia boss in Chicago, the man feared by the whole underworld, sank down beside the narrow hospital bed and dropped to his knees on the cold tile floor, taking Audrey's hand in both of his. "Audrey," he said, his voice hoarse from crying and roaring, and from 9 years of suffering exploding out of him all at once. 9 years ago I was young. I was weak. I still lived under her shadow, but this is not 9 years ago. I have my own empire now, my own power, my own men, and I swear, on everything I have, on my own life, I will never let her touch you or Hope again. Never. Then he stood up, pulled out his phone, and dialed. "Briggs," he said, and his voice turned cold again, low and final, the voice of the crime lord. "Transfer $10,000 to this clinic right now, and I want the best doctor in the city here to examine her. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what time it is. Right now." Briggs nodded and stepped back into the hallway to make the calls. Dr. Warren stood in the doorway, his eyes wide, unable to speak. Throughout everything that had just happened, from the moment the door opened to the moment Damon punched the wall, from the moment Audrey wept out the truth to the moment Damon dropped to his knees beside the bed, there was one person in the room no one had truly noticed. Hope. She had been standing in the corner of the room, her back pressed against the wall beside the small medicine cabinet. She had stood there ever since Damon came in, retreating farther and farther into the corner because she was frightened, because she was overwhelmed, because everything was happening too fast and too violently for an 8-year-old child to understand. She stood there and watched her mother cry, watched the man whom only a few hours earlier she had known only as the owner of the mansion, and now knew as her father, roar in pain and strike the wall, watched the blood rise on his hand, watched him fall to his knees beside her mother's bed, heard him swear his promise, heard him call to have the money transferred, heard his voice break apart, then turn cold, then break apart all over again, and she trembled from beginning to end. Her 2 hands clutched the hem of her old dress until the fabric was wrinkled and crushed, her injured left knee still throbbing, tears gathering in her eyes without falling. She didn't understand everything. She was 8 years old. She didn't understand what mafia meant. She didn't understand what empire meant. She didn't understand why grown people had to be so complicated. But she understood one thing: the man kneeling beside her mother's bed, the man with red swollen eyes and a bleeding hand from punching the wall, the man who had just sworn that he would protect her and her mother, that man was her father. Her father was not dead. Her father was alive. Her father was here. The room fell quiet again. Damon was still kneeling beside the bed, one hand holding Audrey's, his head bowed, his shoulders trembling faintly. Audrey lay against the pillows, her eyes closed, tears slipping back into her hair. Dr. Warren and Briggs had stepped back into the hallway and pulled the door almost shut, leaving the three of them alone in the small room. The silence stretched on, so long that the ticking of the clock sounded as loud as a hammer striking wood. Then a voice rose into the quiet, small, smaller than a whisper, small as a breath carrying only 2 syllables. "Daddy." Damon turned so fast it was as if some invisible force had yanked him by a wire. His whole body twisted toward the corner of the room where Hope stood, and he saw his daughter, the 8-year-old little girl, thin and frail, in a torn old dress, with blood still crusted on her knee, standing in the corner of a hospital room, her eyes red, tears sliding down her cheeks, looking at him with a pair of eyes he recognized at once. Those eyes, gray, like steel, like his. Those eyes looked at him, and the word daddy echoed through his mind again and again, each time louder than before, like waves crashing against stone. That one word struck Damon harder than any bullet he had ever taken in his life, harder than any blow he had ever endured, harder than the weight of 9 lost years gathered together, because this was the first time in all his 36 years on Earth that anyone had called him daddy. Damon Kessler, Mafia boss, the man feared by the entire Chicago underworld, the man Briggs had followed for 10 years without ever once seeing him cry, wept. He wept in front of his daughter. Tears streamed down his hard, carved face and fell onto the hospital tile, and he didn't wipe them away, didn't hide them, didn't turn his head. "Are you really my daddy?" Hope asked, her voice fragile and trembling, filled with doubt and hope all at once. Damon stepped toward her, then sank down onto his knees, right there on the cold hospital floor, until he was at her eye level, so she would not have to tilt her head up to look at him, so she could look straight into his eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," he said, his voice hoarse and broken, but every word solid as stone. "I am your daddy, and I'm sorry. I'm sorry that for 8 years you had no father. I'm sorry you had to carry flowers through the streets to sell them. I'm sorry you had to knock on strangers' doors and beg them to buy flowers so you could save your mother. I'm sorry you had to grow up without knowing who I was. But from today, from this moment on, I'll be here, I promise." Hope looked at him, looked for a long time, looked at the gray eyes that matched the eyes she saw in the mirror every morning, looked at the straight nose shaped like her own, looked at the outline of a face she had never known she had inherited from anyone. Then she lifted one tiny hand and touched Damon's cheek. Her hand was soft and warm and still dusty from the road, touching the cold roughness of the Mafia boss's face. "Your eyes look like mine," she said softly. Damon smiled. For the first time in a very long time, he smiled for real. A smile breaking through tears, through 9 years of loss. "Yes, my eyes look like yours. Because you are my daughter. My daughter." Hope stepped forward, wrapped her tiny arms around Damon's neck, and held him tight. Damon held her back, held her with the same arms he had used to build an empire, to smash walls, to seize power. But now those arms were holding only an 8-year-old little girl, and they trembled. On the hospital bed, Audrey watched father and daughter holding each other, and she cried. Not tears of fear. For the first time that night, they were something else. And Damon closed his eyes, pressed his face into his daughter's tangled hair, and for the first time in 9 years, he felt whole. The days that followed passed in a kind of fragile peace that all three of them knew could shatter at any moment, though no one said it aloud. Damon arranged for Audrey to be moved into a private room in the clinic, the best room the place had, cleaner, with a softer bed, with a window looking out onto the maple trees along the road. He came every day. He didn't miss a single day. Each morning he brought hot food, not hospital food, but meals prepared, especially at his instruction. Chicken soup, porridge, fresh orange juice, the kinds of things Audrey and Hope had never had before. He brought new clothes for both of them, pretty dresses for Hope, warm sweaters for Audrey. He brought sketchbooks and colored pencils for Hope, because in one conversation, she had casually mentioned that she liked to draw, but had never owned a full set of colors, only a few old pencils given to her by other children. The next day, Damon arrived with a box of 64 colored pencils, every shade Hope had never seen in one place before. She sat hugging the box and drew all afternoon, her eyes shining, and Damon sat beside her watching his daughter draw without saying a word, simply watching, as though he were trying to memorize every moment to make up for the 8 years he had not been allowed to see. The three of them began learning each other slowly, carefully, like three strangers who had found one another in the middle of ruins and were now learning how to trust again. Hope began to open up more. She told Damon about school, about the teacher she liked, about the one close friend she had named May who sat beside her in class. She told him about the days when her mother had been too sick to get out of bed, and she had to boil water by herself, make instant noodles for herself, walk to school alone. She told these things in an ordinary voice, as though they were ordinary things, because to her they were. She didn't know that an 8-year-old child should not have had to cook alone, should not have had to worry that her mother might die, should not have had to sell flowers on the street to pay medical bills. But Damon knew, and every story Hope told, every small detail that seemed ordinary to her but horrifying to him, made something inside Damon hurt more. His jaw hardened, his fists clenched beneath the table where Hope could not see them. He had to bite the inside of his lip to keep from letting out a roar of rage. Rage at his mother, rage at himself for not finding them sooner, rage at the whole world for allowing his daughter to grow up like this. On the 7th day, Dr. Warren came into the room wearing the first real smile he had shown since he met Hope. "Good news," he said. "Audrey is recovering very well. If everything continues like this, in about 3 days she should be able to leave the clinic." Damon nodded. "Good, thank you, doctor." But that same afternoon, while Damon was sitting beside Audrey's bed watching Hope draw, his phone vibrated. He looked at the screen. Briggs. He stepped into the hallway and answered. "Boss," Briggs said, his voice low and even, but Damon could hear the tension beneath it. "Mrs. Constance wants to see you. She says it's urgent." Damon was silent for 3 seconds. His jaw tightened. He had known this day would come. He had been waiting for it. A part of him had even wanted it to come sooner, so he could face her, so he could finally say the things he had swallowed for 9 long years. "Tell her I'll be there in an hour," Damon said, his voice flat as the surface of a frozen lake. He ended the call and stepped back into the room. Audrey looked at him from the bed. She had heard enough. Not every word, but she had seen his face change when he walked into the hallway, and she saw it change again when he returned. Her face went white. "She knows," Audrey said. It was not a question. It was a statement. Damon walked to the bedside and took Audrey's hand. His hand was warm, steady, and didn't tremble. "Yes," he said. "She knows." Audrey closed her eyes. The fear she had lived with for 9 years rose inside her chest again. Familiar, freezing, like a tide of cold water that could not be held back. "This time I'm ready, Audrey," Damon said, his voice soft but heavy. "I'm not the 27-year-old man I was back then. This time I'm ready." Then he bent down, pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, straightened, adjusted his suit jacket, and walked out of the room. When the black SUV stopped in front of the iron gates of the Kessler mansion, Damon sat motionless in the car for 3 seconds. He looked at the mansion where he had grown up, the place where he had learned how to walk, how to speak, how to give orders, how to make people afraid. Then he opened the door, stepped out, and walked straight inside. He didn't knock. It was still his house, even if after tonight it might no longer be. Constance was sitting in the sitting room, in the armchair where she always sat, the chair that even Damon, as a child, had never dared to sit in. She sat with her back straight, one leg crossed over the other, her left hand resting on the armrest, her right hand holding a white porcelain teacup. She had changed into proper clothes, her silver hair pinned high without a single strand out of place, an expensive black outfit, pearls at her throat. She sat there so calm it was frightening, as though this meeting were nothing more than an ordinary afternoon tea, and not a confrontation between mother and son over the fact that she had threatened to kill her own granddaughter 9 years earlier. "Sit down, Damon," she said, her voice even, soft, without a ripple in it. Damon didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room, his arms at his sides, looking straight at his mother. "What do you want?" he asked. Constance took a sip of tea, set the cup back on its saucer, the porcelain touching with a faint sound. "I know about that girl, and the child," she said. "That woman, whatever her name is, Audrey something, she has come back, and this time she is cleverer, using the child as bait to deceive you. Her name is Audrey," Damon said, his voice low, "and that child is Hope, your biological granddaughter." Constance placed her hand on her lap, her fingers tapping lightly, her face expressionless. "She is not my granddaughter. She has my eyes, Mother." "A coincidence. You know it isn't." Constance straightened more fully in her chair, lifting her chin. Damon, I've already told you. She's a gold digger. 9 years ago, she wanted to use the pregnancy to trap you. Now she's using the child. The same old trick. You were fooled once, and now you intend to be fooled again? Damon stepped closer to his mother. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. Each footfall struck the marble floor with a slow, even, heavy sound. He stopped 2 steps away from her, and then he lowered his voice. Lowered it until it was almost a whisper. But it was not the whisper of a man speaking softly. It was the whisper of a man who didn't need to raise his voice, the kind of voice his enemies heard and knew they were about to die. You threatened to kill my child, Damon said, each word falling with the weight of a hammer. You went to Audrey's room in the middle of the night, alone. You looked her in the eye and told her you would kill the baby inside her. You drove her away. You made her disappear. And you stole 9 years of my life. 9 years when I didn't get to watch my daughter grow up. 9 birthdays when I didn't get to blow out candles with her. 9 years when my daughter grew up without a father, had to sell flowers on the street, had to make instant noodles for herself when her mother was sick, had to knock on door after door in the rich neighborhood and beg strangers to buy flowers so she could get money to save her mother. Constance didn't move. The teacup on the saucer still gave off steam, but her fingers stopped tapping. I protected you from a mistake, she began. Be quiet. Those 2 words were not shouted. Damon didn't shout. He roared. His voice was deep, vibrating, rising from the bottom of his chest. The kind of sound not everyone could make. The sound of absolute power. The sound that made the whole room seem to tremble when it appeared. Constance Kessler, the 64-year-old woman who had ruled this family with an iron hand for decades, leaned back in her chair. Half a step. Only half a step, but it was the first half step she had ever taken backward before her son in her life, and both of them knew it. If you're threatening to cut me off financially, Damon said, his voice dropping again, low, even, dangerous, do it. I don't need your money. I have my own. If you're threatening to cut ties with me, I accept that. But if you touch my family, if you touch Audrey or Hope, even 1 strand of hair on their heads, then you'll find out who your son really is. And you won't like that. Silence. Heavy. Stretching on. Constance looked at Damon, and for the first time, she didn't see the 27-year-old son she had once controlled. Standing in front of her was Damon Kessler, the crime lord, the man the entire Chicago underworld respected and feared. And his eyes were telling her that he was not making a threat. He was making a promise. Audrey and Hope are moving into my penthouse in Lincoln Park, Damon said. They are my family. If you can accept that, good. If not, then you and I have nothing left to say to each other. Constance sat still for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice trembling faintly for the first time in the entire conversation. You choose them over your own mother? Damon looked straight into her eyes. You made that choice for me 9 years ago, when you threatened to kill your own granddaughter. I'm only living with the consequences you created. He turned his back and walked toward the doorway of the sitting room, every step firm, even, without hesitation. Damon, Constance's voice came from behind him. If you walk through that door, don't come back. Damon stopped. His feet halted in mid-step, his back still turned toward her. He didn't look around. 3 seconds of silence. As long as 3 years. Then he spoke. 2 words. Soft, clear, final. Goodbye, Mother. He walked through the doorway, down the long hall, out the front door, down the stone steps, across the white gravel path, and through the gate. Briggs already had the car door open. Damon stepped inside and sat in the back seat. The door shut. The car pulled away from the Kessler mansion. Damon sat in silence in the back, staring out the window. The mansion grew smaller in the rearview mirror. Smaller, smaller. Then it disappeared, and tears ran down his face. But they were not tears of sorrow, not tears of pain. They were the tears of a man who had finally cut through the chain wrapped around his throat his whole life. For the first time in 9 years, Damon Kessler felt free. 3 days later, Audrey was discharged. Damon came to pick them up in the black SUV, with Briggs driving, and in the back seat he had already placed a new set of clothes for Audrey and a small pink backpack filled with colored pencils and sketchbooks for Hope. When the car stopped in front of the high-rise in Lincoln Park, Hope pressed her face to the window and looked up, her mouth falling open. The building was so tall that she had to tilt her head back as far as it would go and still could not see the top. Damon brought the two of them up to the highest floor in a private elevator. When the elevator doors opened, Hope stopped in her tracks. The penthouse was enormous, with 3 bedrooms, a living room as large as the entire old apartment where she and her mother had lived, a gleaming modern kitchen, oak floors warm as honey, and a wide balcony overlooking the Chicago skyline, skyscrapers glittering beneath the late afternoon sun, and in the distance, the deep blue of Lake Michigan stretching all the way to the horizon. Hope looked around for 1 second, and then she ran. She ran all through the home, from the living room to the kitchen, from the kitchen to the first bedroom, then the second, then the third. She opened every door, looked inside, her eyes wide and round. "Are we really going to live here?" she shouted from the third bedroom, the room Damon had arranged just for her, with a new bed, a new blanket, new pillows, and a small empty bookshelf waiting to be filled. "Is this room mine? Really mine?" "It's yours," Damon said, standing in the doorway with his arms folded across his chest, watching his daughter bounce across her new bed with a smile he would remember for the rest of his life. Audrey stood in the middle of the living room and said nothing. She looked around at the great windows filled with light, at the shining clean kitchen, at the wide balcony with fresh flowers set in one corner, and tears slipped down her cheeks, quietly, over the face that was still pale from illness. "Damon," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "this is too much. You didn't have to do all of this." Damon walked over to her. "This is what you both should have had 9 years ago. Don't call it too much. It's too little." Audrey looked at him and wanted to say more, but her throat closed, so she only nodded, wiped her tears away, and nodded once again. That afternoon, while the sunlight slanted through the living room windows, Audrey stood on the balcony looking down at the streets below. Everything was peaceful. A soft wind moved her hair. Hope's laughter floated out from inside the apartment. Then Audrey looked down at the street and saw a black sedan parked across from the building. Dark windows, engine still running. Her heart tightened instantly. Both hands gripped the balcony railing until her knuckles went white. She stepped back inside, her face drained, breathing too fast. Damon noticed at once. He walked out onto the balcony, saw the car, and immediately understood the ghost of the past that was haunting her. Damon turned, went back inside, and placed his hands on Audrey's shaking shoulders. "It's just a neighbor, Audrey," he said softly. "You are safe now. I am here. It's the 12th floor neighbor's car. The driver is only waiting for the owner." Audrey let out a breath, but her hands were still shaking. She knew it was irrational. She knew this penthouse was safe, with Briggs, with security, with Damon. But 9 years of living in fear didn't vanish simply because she had moved into a new home. Fear had settled into her bones, into her blood, into the way she startled at the sound of the doorbell, into the way she always looked over her shoulder when she walked down the street. Damon drew her into his arms. "You'll get used to it," he said softly. "I promise. I'll protect both of you." That evening, after their first meal together in the new kitchen, Damon sat on Hope's bed and read her a story before sleep. He read awkwardly, because he had never read stories aloud to anyone before, and the voice of a mafia boss reading a fairy tale sounded strange enough that Hope could not help giggling. But halfway through, she suddenly stopped laughing and looked at Damon with serious gray eyes. "Daddy," she said, "are you a bad man?" Damon stopped reading. The book remained open in his hands, but he was no longer looking at it. "Why do you ask that?" "When I was standing at your gate, the guard said your name in a really scared voice, like you were very dangerous. Are you very dangerous?" Damon was silent. Silent for a very long time, so long that Hope thought he might not answer. He looked at his daughter, the 8-year-old child staring at him with eyes exactly like his own, except a million times clearer, not yet stained by the world. Then he spoke. "I'm not a perfectly good man, Hope. I've done many things I'm not proud of. But there is one thing I'm sure of, and it's this. I will never do anything bad to you or your mother. For you, I will always be the best man I can be." Hope looked at him, tilting her head, thinking in the way only an 8-year-old child thinks, simply, directly, without calculation. Then she nodded. "I believe you." She wrapped her arms around Damon, pressed her face against his chest, and fell asleep. Damon sat there holding her without moving, looking out the bedroom window at the city lights glittering far away. His eyes were wet. When Hope was sleeping deeply, Damon gently laid her back on the pillow, pulled up the blanket, and stepped outside. Audrey was sitting on the balcony. Her hair moved softly in the night wind. The lights of Chicago sparkled below, millions of tiny points like stars fallen onto the earth. Lake Michigan lay dark and wide in the distance, silent and immense. Damon sat down beside her. The two of them were quiet for a while, looking at the city, listening to the wind, listening to each other's breathing. Then Audrey spoke, softly as the breeze. "I never stopped loving you, not even when I ran, not even when I told myself I had to forget you. My heart would not let go." Damon turned and looked at her. 9 years, Audrey," he said. 9 years I met so many people. None of them were you. None of them could ever be you." Audrey rested her head against Damon's shoulder. He wrapped an arm around her. The two of them sat that way on the balcony, looking out at the city lights, saying nothing more. Nothing more was needed. 9 years of loss could not be repaired with words, but it could begin to be repaired with presence. That same night, more than 20 minutes away by car from the Lincoln Park penthouse, the Kessler mansion lay drowned in darkness. No light in the sitting room, no light in the hallway. The entire house was blacked out, as though it had died along with the conversation earlier that afternoon. But on the second floor, at the far end of the east corridor, one room still held light, not lamplight, only the faint glow of streetlights filtering through a crack in the curtains, enough to reveal the outline of someone sitting inside. Constance sat in her late husband's old study, the room she had kept untouched since the day he died, not changing a single thing, not moving one book, not dusting one picture frame. This room was the only place in the mansion where Constance allowed herself to be weak, though she had never permitted that weakness to last for long. She sat in her husband's leather chair, her back straight, both hands resting on the oak desk. The tea in the cup beside her had long gone cold, and she had not touched it. Her eyes were fixed on the darkness, but she was not looking at the darkness. She was looking inward, into herself, where anger was slowly rising, thick and heavy as molten tar. Then she bent down and opened the bottom drawer of the desk. This drawer had its own lock, a key she always wore around her neck beside her pearl necklace. She turned the key, opened the drawer, and took out an old wooden box. The box was small, just large enough for 2 hands, the wood darkened with age. She lifted the lid. Inside was a file, not thick, but horrifyingly complete. A file on Audrey Sinclair. 9 years. 1 page of updates for every year. Photographs taken in secret of Audrey selling flowers at the intersection. The address of the apartment in the outskirts where Audrey and her daughter lived. The name of the clinic where Audrey gave birth to Hope. Hope's date of birth. Hope's school. The name of her homeroom teacher. The name of the little friend who sat beside her in class. Everything. Every detail. Every year. Constance had never stopped watching. For 9 years, she had known where Audrey was, how she lived, how old her daughter was, which school she attended. She had known everything, but she had not acted. Because Audrey had disappeared on her own, exactly as Constance had wanted. The girl had been smart enough to be afraid, smart enough to run, and smart enough never to come back to Gold Coast. So Constance had left her alone, believing that Audrey was a broken woman who would never dare to return to the world of the powerful. She watched from a distance like a hawk circling its prey, knowing exactly where they were but seeing no reason to dive yet. But now it was different. Now Damon had found them. Now Damon had fallen to his knees and called that child his daughter. Now Damon had turned his back on her and walked through that door. Constance turned the pages of the file one by one, slowly. Her fingers trembled faintly when they touched the photograph of Audrey selling flowers at the intersection, but not with fear, with rage, the thick rage inside her chest rising slowly like lava. She closed the box, set it down on the desk, and picked up the telephone. She dialed a number, waited through 2 rings. "I have something that needs to be done," she said, her voice flat and without a ripple. "Prepare Plan B." She set the phone down, looked out the window. Outside, the Chicago night was black, with distant streetlights flickering far away. Her eyes were colder than they had been 9 years earlier, colder than on the night she stood outside Audrey's rented room. "My son," she whispered into the dark, "do you think you've won?" She rose from the chair, walked to the window, and looked out over the city where her son was now holding the woman she had wanted erased from his life. Not yet. And so, that night, on the balcony of the penthouse in Lincoln Park, Damon held Audrey in his arms. Though he knew his mother's shadows were still moving in the dark, he looked out at the city not with fear, but with the cold resolve of a man ready to fight for his blood. Hope slept peacefully in her new room, shielded by a father who would never let the past win again. 3 people torn apart by lies, power, and fear had finally found one another again because of the courage of an 8-year-old little girl carrying a bucket of flowers into the world of the powerful. But as Constance's plan B began to unfold in the silence of the night, one question remained. Would this hard-won happiness last? Or would the Kessler legacy return with a vengeance to swallow this family whole? This story reminds us that love is not measured by money or power, but by the quiet sacrifice of a mother willing to give up everything so her child may live, and by the courage of a child who refuses to surrender, even when the whole world turns its back. If this story touched your heart, please press the like button and share it so that more people can hear it. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss the next stories that will be even more moving than this one. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of someone in your real life? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. We would truly love to hear what is living deep inside your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.